thank you all for coming out today. I know it was really dreary, and about 11:45 I was thinking nobody's coming, so I'm glad to see you all here. Porches are a standard feature of American architecture, and so much so that we almost take them for granted. Pretty much like Ed said, if you had a house, you probably had a porch, and you probably used it and enjoyed it. The program title, which I know has gotten a lot of laughs, I pulled that out of a segment on NPR that they did on front porches about 10 years ago. The interviewer was talking to Kendra Powell about the porches in her neighborhood, and she was pointing out the vibe of each porch. And when it was asked what it would be like to live in a house without a porch, she shot that idea down immediately as boring. Even when her friend chimed in and was saying, how great it is to have a big backyard with a deck. And that kind of love for the porch is not a new or unique sentiment. Andrew Jackson Downing, writing in 1842, said much the same thing as Kendra. The porch, veranda, or piazza are highly characteristic features, and no dwelling house can be considered complete without one or more of them. And for about 100 years, from that 1840 to 1940, America had a golden age of porches, which shaped and influenced the architecture and the people around it. And as I'm sure you know, the topic of porches is broad and deep, and there's a lot of avenues to go in. So I'm probably not going to cover everything you might have hoped to hear today, but I am going to take you through some different types of porches, their origins, some history, and some little trivia about them, and hopefully you'll find something new and interesting to think about next time you look at a porch. So, first thing, what is a porch? And obviously it's a structure that's attached to a building to shelter an entrance, or to serve as a semi-enclosed space. And this encompasses all the types of covered outdoor entrances in America. So you can have a front porch, you can have a back porch, you can have a side porch. You can have one that's 1 story or 2 stories or taller, or they can be open, they can be screened in with mesh to keep the insects out, or they could be walled in glass. So your basic parts of a porch, basically baseline, what you need to have a porch. You've got to have a roof. You have to have some supports to hold up the roof. Some kind of flooring or decking to walk on. Usually you have a step up or two, because you don't want it right on ground level. And a porch can be something simple, just like a stoop. And that's your basic outdoor flight of stairs with a platform at the top that goes right to the front door. Or you can have something that's really grand, like a portico. And this is a porch, with a roof. Usually it has a pediment on the top, this triangular part in the middle. That's very indicative of Greek Revival. And you can also see them in some classical Revival buildings. And most often, especially in Winchester, we associate this with our public buildings or large antebellum homes. And then kind of in the middle, we have the veranda. And this one is a covered porch, usually wraps around most of the sides of the house. And it was especially planned for summer leisure. So if you think of relaxing on a porch, you probably have a veranda in mind. And as I mentioned, we had a century of porches from about 1840 to 1940, where they were almost a universal element of our buildings. And by the 1900s, right about 1890 to 1900, that was the height of the porch. And every American house either had a porch, or if they didn't, they were thought to be unfashionable. And this is a longer quote, but I'll read a little excerpt of it. Porches were never so popular as they are today. At least it would be an odd house in America that has not its veranda equipped and furnished for everyday use. And that was in 1906. But as we saw, there's a lot of variations on porches, what you do, what they look like. And you might kind of wonder, where do they come from? And like America herself, our porches are also a melting pot of ideas from around the world. Historically, going way back, the porch or the portico referred to the columned entry of a Greek or Roman temple. By the Middle Ages, the use of the word porch had transferred to the vestibule of the church, where you would gather to socialize before and after the service. So those two things fix the idea of often the appearance of the porch and the use that you would socialize there. It was kind of interesting as I was doing the research to figure out when I could actually start researching for porches and not piazzas or verandas or something. Because the word porch didn't transfer to what we think of as a porch until 1900, and it seems more focused in America. I've read an English dictionary of architecture, and they seemed very bemused by our use of the word porch for a house. The first American vernacular style, something that we kind of came up with homegrown, that almost always had a porch, is the shotgun house, which we typically associate with Afro-Caribbean building traditions that were brought in, especially to New Orleans, by the free blacks that were fleeing from Haiti during the Haitian Revolution. You can also find porches very early on with French and Spanish colonial building, which obviously we didn't have here in the Valley. But, as time went on, basically, if settlers or immigrants to America had a good porch idea and they introduced it to us, chances are we were going to incorporate it in our American porches. I think before we go on, it's easy to say every house had a porch. But not all of them did. And instead of trying to go through all the styles that generally have a porch, I'm going to tell you some of the styles that don't typically have any kind of grand porch. I think that's a little easier. Your true revival style, like this building, they don't normally have a porch. Usually, if they have any kind of porch, it's going to be in a small cross gable that projects out just a little bit from the house. You can see this one, I think they have maybe 2 steps up. Your Spanish eclectic styles, so these are kind of the second revival of the Spanish buildings. Usually these will have balconies more so than a porch at ground level. And then I'm sure we all know these, your modern international brutalism, anything that's kind of square and boxy that started from the 1920s and we'll say 1960s, 1970s. Also, your very early vernacular Georgian Federal and some Greek Revival houses. They might not have a grand porch that you would think of. They might have just a wraparound, a little stoop, a couple stairs up. And that's all okay. What can happen, especially if you have a nicer style Federal or Greek Revival building, is as the building owners became more wealthy, they might add and work on that porch. And I'm sure some of you have probably seen this building before. It's the Chanticleer Inn, which I think I've done a couple times in Vanished Winchester presentations. So this building is no longer here, but it was a really good example of how porches have changed through time. So you can see, we know it was built about 1850. It was definitely Greek Revival style. So the top photo was taken circa 1880, and they don't have a porch. Looks like they just have the stoop and the door surround. But by 1900, by that magic period of porches, you can see that they've actually added at least 2 on. They added a very fancy kind of Italianate looking style front porch on. And then also they added a more informal, probably a sitting veranda on the side where they used to have a side yard. So basically they gave up their side yard to have a porch. Another thing I can kind of tell you about while we're looking at this is when you're looking at the porches, the roof supports are often a big clue as to pinpointing the style of the porch or the era that it was constructed. And very briefly, there are 3 types of supports. You can have columns, posts, pilasters. So columns are the round ones that you'll see on that informal side porch on the bottom. Your posts are square, and I'm pretty sure the front porch on the bottom picture is a square post that probably has chamfered edges. And then on the very top, on the original, there's just the door surround. Anything that would have looked like a column that's against the door, that's your pilaster. So your pilasters are not structurally integral. Usually they're just a flat piece of board that's mounted to the wall. The other 2, the posts and columns, are.
Could I ask you?
Yes.
Is it just the light on the bottom picture, or did they paint the brick, or is it just...
I think they painted the brick. Yeah. Which is another pretty common thing that you do. And I'm sure everybody here, if you're an architecture fan, you probably know about the 5 classical orders. Basically, columns are a classic choice for pretty much any style. You can make a column work with it. A couple shortcuts, if you're looking at the columns and you're trying to get an idea maybe what style it is. If you have the Doric columns, which are the big, massive, round columns, no fancy capital style on them, you're probably looking at a Greek Revival style building. If you see the Corinthian and composite columns, the ones that are very fancy and decorative, you might want to think about something like Beaux Arts, so think the Hanley Library. And Ionic columns, the ones in the middle, you might know those are supposed to look like scrolls, and because of that, the Ionic columns kind of has this reputation that they're associated with government buildings or academic buildings. And that's, not blanket statement, don't take that as like, that's an Ionic column, so that was definitely a government building. Like, that's just a rough guideline. But one thing I can tell you is if you find paired or grouped columns, those were probably added sometime after 1900. And these in particular are something you're going to find in your Craftsman, your Foursquare, your bungalows, colonial revivals, some of your late Victorian Queen Anne's. Most people probably could not have afforded a grand portico on their house in 1850. But as more and more wood preparation became mechanized, it became a lot easier for the average person to afford a fashionable-looking porch. And part of that was because of the wood posts and all of the jigsaw ornamentation. That all of this stuff that used to be done entirely by hand was starting to be mechanized. And they could turn out exact copies, too. So starting with the Gothic Revival style, so that's going to be your Stonewall Jackson's headquarters here in town. And that's 1840s, father of the American porch, Andrew Jackson Downing. He was the first kind of proponent of that. And then especially more so after the Civil War was when you're going to start seeing your Italianate buildings, your Queen Anne buildings, your folk Victorian style buildings that have that square post with a fancy jigsaw decoration on it. And I think I briefly mentioned chamfered post, and if you've never really seen this, this is the front of the hexagon house, where normally your post would be square, just entirely square. The chamfer is where they came along with a plane and just beveled off the edge and made a little tongue towards the bottom. The other style that you could get like this is your turned spindles. We usually associate those with like the Queen Anne style, but you can find them other places too. The other style that's pretty unique to like one subset of architecture is Craftsman style posts, columns. And usually they're like a tapered square column, and a lot of time, like they are in this building, you can see that they're set up on like brick or stone or some other material that kind of gives them a visual interruption. And this is an interesting house that I've found. My guess is it's probably older, and they put on that bay on the side, and then later they put on a veranda. And as the changes happened, they just kind of incorporated whatever style of the time to fit their additions on the house. So this is very much 1900s, 1930s, but you can find them on new construction today. I've seen a lot of them. They're a very popular style. The other kind of big character-defining feature on the porch is what the floor is made out of. And we especially think of tongue-and-groove wood flooring as your standard. If you've got a porch floor, it's probably tongue-and-groove. And I was wondering, when did that become available? Because, you can see those are pretty precise cuts that you're going to have to match up. And I was a little surprised to find that tongue-and-groove boards were being manufactured in Baltimore by 1830. Howland and Woolen's planing factory and steam saw mill has 1 pit saw, 3 circular saws, a turning lathe, and 4 planing machines in full operation, capable of planing, tonguing, and grooving from 8 to 10,000 feet of boards per day. So that's pretty good for 1833. But tongue and groove is not your only historic choice. In an article, The Porch and Its Uses, the author explains a porch at ground level should be of brick, tile, stone, or concrete, for a wooden floor at ground level, no matter how dry the spot, will last but a short time. And now you might be wondering, well, how historic is that concrete porch? And this might surprise you, but there are probably concrete porches out there that are over 100 years old by this point. And that's pretty historic by American standards. Concrete started to be used after the Civil War, but it really didn't become widespread in construction until after 1900. The oldest manual that I found for a person to try to make his own concrete porch and elements was from 1912, and it gave them instructions on how to pour your concrete floor, your steps, the aprons, which is the kind of skirting that goes along the front of the porch, and your posts. And in addition to that, you could also order from catalogs various molds. They could do more decorative elements, and even your balusters, urns, flower boxes, pretty much anything you could think of, you could probably get a mold and make out of concrete to put on your porch. One of the things that's definitely character defining, you might love it, you might hate it, is screening your porch. And there were primitive kind of window screens made out of cheesecloth. As long as you had cheesecloth, you could put something up against your windows and try to keep the bugs out. But the oldest advertisement for a wire mesh type screen for a window dates back to the 1820s. And the screening of the windows didn't become common until the 1860s. There was, I don't know how true this story is, I'm taking it as apocryphal until I find more backup on this. But supposedly there was a manufacturer that had an overrun of wire mesh that was left over from making sieves. And they couldn't figure out what to do with it, so an employee came up with the idea that we will paint this screen and we will sell them as window screens. And apparently he saved the company. Take it as you will. Home journals, looms that were large enough to do your whole porch or to do larger panels became common after 1900. So once that happened, the home journals started telling people to screen a porch, especially if you had one, off of your kitchen, because that would help you to keep on working during the hottest part of the day. You wouldn't have flies and mosquitoes that would be getting into your food. You could also use that space for a dining area in the evening. It would be cooler than inside of the house. And they also had a smart little idea that that would be a good place to temporarily store your garbage and your cleaning supplies. So it wouldn't be in the main house. It would be halfway outside already. But probably no type of porch used screening of some sort more than the sleeping porch. And these were usually placed on a higher story for privacy for the sleepers, and located where you can best catch some cool breezes, but you also didn't want the sun to come in too early and wake you up too soon. These sleeping porches really gained popularity at the turn of the 20th century as part of the hygiene movement, and the screening of them was especially important in a related issue, which was fighting mosquito-transmitted diseases. So the two big mosquito diseases that you were going to screen your porch against were malaria and yellow fever. Mosquitoes were identified as the source of what they'd kind of termed up to that point bad air or night air. If you've ever maybe read something historic and you've seen references to everybody closing up the house at night and staying away from the bad vapors, what they were really trying to protect themselves from was the mosquitoes that were bringing the malaria and yellow fever. Both of these diseases were very widespread, especially in the south and along the coastal regions. But once the cause of the was identified as mosquitoes, these mosquito control agencies kind of popped up to combat mosquitoes. They had pesticides at their disposal. They also were proponents of eliminating standing water so they couldn't breed. And they also had this movement to screen your windows and your doors and your porches so you could go outside and not be attacked by the insects. And what I found really interesting was all of these kind of agencies said the screening was the most effective thing they did to prevent the spread of the diseases. So about the same time that we were working on malaria and yellow fever, we were also working on tuberculosis. In 1882, they identified the cause of tuberculosis as bacteria, and poor ventilation, overcrowded housing, and a lack of understanding about sanitation practices were the three big factors that they identified for the rapid spread of the disease. Even though they knew it was a bacteria, they didn't really have a good treatment for it until they found an effective antibiotic in the 1940s. And between 1880 to 1940, pretty much your treatment was going to be getting some fresh air, sunshine, rest, improve your hygiene, improve your nutrition if you could. If you had tuberculosis in the U.S., and you might have gone to a sanatorium, which would have basically given you that treatment. The first one opened in the U.S. in 1884. But if you didn't want to leave your home or you couldn't leave your home, you could try some of these treatments on your own. And just like the mosquito agencies, groups popped up that were educating people on how to ventilate your home and how to improve your hygiene habits. In a book called Fresh Air and How to Use It, the author states in the foreword, "There is no point at which the campaign against tuberculosis has had a more beneficial effect than in the change of attitude towards the value of fresh air, both in health and disease. Emphasized first as an agent of cure, the public is now beginning to recognize its value as a mode of prevention." And a lot of these educational groups actually focused on children, trying to get them good hygiene habits early. And this was a little rhyming booklet that it looked like maybe they gave out at schools. And they actually suggested that a handy boy could build his own sleeping porch. Hopefully his parents would help him.
So they actually pushed sleeping porches for help.
Mm-hmm. In that fresh air. Yeah. Yeah, the Fresh Air and How to Use It book, I think, was a Red Cross book. And The whole thing was just how to basically get a bed outside, keep the bed sanitary, fresh air. A lot of them have, just like this boy is kind of wrapped up in what we'd probably call a Snuggie today. They tell you all year round, go out, sleep on the porch, just wrap up and just have your face open. They were hardcore, I'm telling you. So, as I said, by 1900, sleeping porches were kind of a requirement for every house to be considered modern and up to date. And because they were often added to the older houses, the how-to books like to give advice on how to design the sleeping porch. Permanent porches should be designed in an artistic manner so to harmonize with the building to which they are added. Usually, they should be constructed of the same material as that used in the main structure, and if possible, appear to be part of the original design and not an afterthought. And this one I thought was a pretty good example. I believe the front of the house, this is on South Kent Street, I believe the front of the house is about 1830. And, you can tell they put on a couple additions, but that upper story was probably the sleeping porch, and they did a really good job of just incorporating it in the building. Now, if you were looking to build a new house, a lot of the design catalogs of the time really emphasized the sleeping porch and touted the ventilation of the bedrooms for that same tuberculosis and health reasons. And this particular design also touches on the size of the sleeping porch, so you could get 2 beds out there. But also both the front porch and the sleeping porch were noted to be very easy to enclose either with screen or with glass as the seasons changed. So you would keep using that porch throughout the year. But, all of this talk about health, kind of depressing. Porches aren't just for that reason. They're also a good place for playtime. And, they've always been a place where you go out, you have fun, social gatherings, and relaxation, and especially summertime use. And as America became industrialized, you had more and more free time to relax after work. The easiest place to do so would be on your own front porch. And in a lot of cases, the front porch became an extension of your living room. So you could go outside and play games, read a newspaper, tell the kid, like in this thing, go outside and get some fresh air. Or you could just kind of sit down with a cold drink and watch the world go by. I think maybe some of us have maybe this nostalgic glasses feeling like, the porches, they were always used for something. But Dorothy Scarborough, writing in 1919, has a great quote that I think still kind of encapsulates the use of the porch. "It is only on some magic porch or other that lost art of loafing can be recaptured. It is only on porches that one learns the sweet grace of procrastination, practicing to the limit the high art of putting off till tomorrow some beautiful, perfect mañana, any tomorrow, the task too tedious to be done today." I think that's pretty much perfect. You can also use your porch, of course, for family gatherings, talking to your neighbors, socializing, catching up with people, and a lot of awkward family photos have been taken on porches. And as your day went on, you might sit out there, tell stories, kind of share that family history, watch the lightning bugs, and then you would probably go to sleep on a porch. But if you weren't so lucky and you lived in a city and you didn't really have that experience, if you had the means, it was pretty common for you to leave the city during the hottest part of the summer and go out to a resort hotel, where you kind of get the same experience of sitting on a porch. This one is a resort hotel in Saratoga, New York, and I was just blown away by all of the men sitting there reading the newspaper. I mean, that's amazing to me.
With hats.
With hats! And then a lot of these resort hotels, of course, we had Hotel Winchester, and that one, we didn't necessarily have as far as I've been able to tell, maybe this porch sitting experience, because maybe we didn't have the best views at our resort hotel. I don't know. But we still offered these kind of leisure activities where you'd get out, you'd play your croquet, you'd play your tennis, and then you could go back and sit on the veranda and relax for a while. This is also another really neat image I found of people. It looks like they're actually playing inside of an enclosed porch that's also a resort hotel. And I had no idea that you could have played battledore and shuttlecock on a resort hotel porch, but there you go. And then kind of related to porches, because you were spending all of this time outside, and there was like this whole subculture about sitting on the porch and using the porch, and what do you do on the porch, furnishings became like this subset of new furniture styles. And this is another little quote here. "And then will come the furniture, chairs of exceeding comfort, and as much variety as the space permits. Tables will be brought out as part of the permanent fixtures and used for all sorts of purposes. Rugs of a special type and fabric will be spread upon the floor. A bell for the servant's call will about complete the furnishings, and the veranda will be ready for use and enjoyment." And good old Andrew Jackson Downing, since he was kind of the originator of the porch fad, he recommended your furnishings be made out of rustic wood, like hickory that's been shaped, but you still have the bark on it. So it gives you this kind of transitional feeling from your very formal interior furnishings to your rustic outdoor settings. And that remained popular, from the 1840s to the 1900s. But the big thing we think about with porches is wicker. And wicker became your go-to for porch furnishings from about 1850. And because wicker was so flexible, it could be changed with the evolving styles and tastes of the time. And it's still pretty common to see wicker items out on the porch even today. If you were in a pinch and you couldn't afford new furniture for your porch, you could take the ordinary kitchen chair with a coat of stain or white enamel, and that was satisfactory, not quite as good. But sleeping porches added kind of a new twist to the furnishings, because now you already had tables and chairs that you wanted to take outside. And now you needed a bed, and you might have to move the bed in and outside of the house frequently. You're going to have to protect it from the dust and the pollen. It's going to have to stand up to water in case it rains suddenly and you can't get up to it. And on top of all that, you have to try and keep it sanitary, especially if you were working with a tuberculosis patient. So very simply, you could just take a sleeping bag or a cot. One person writing in Denver, Colorado, said you could just take a blanket outside and lay it on the porch and you'd be okay. I told you, they were hardcore. But, American ingenuity, there had to be a better solution. So if you had an iron bed, kind of like this one, you could put it on casters, so you could roll it between the bedroom and the porch. But if you were looking for something a little more elaborate, there were plans to have a movable bed, so it would run on a track from your inside bedroom out to the sleeping porch. This one is an ad for the Oscillating portal wall bed, so it kind of gives you the view similar to that movable bed, where you pull it out through the wall to sleep, and then maybe push it back inside in the morning. But you could also have these kind of sleeping hammock-type beds that you'd rig up some ropes to the ceiling and the walls, and the bed would be on wood frames with canvas stretched between it. And this particular type had the advantage that you wouldn't have to worry about a mattress getting wet, and they actually, in this advertisement mentioned, you could take that hammock down on the frame and use it as a stretcher if you needed to. But then, if all of that still didn't work for you, you could build a sleeping tower. This one, they're very uncommon. I doubt any have survived. But this one is 40 feet in the air. It has an electric elevator. You can kind of see a little guy peeking out from the elevator. And it was, built in California. And his reasoning for this was at ground level, he wasn't getting the cool breezes. So he just put it up on legs and got up and said it was 10 to 15 degrees cooler up there than a sleeping porch would have been. Yes?
Is that another use, or you hear of the homes along the coast like the bird's nest? Or you build for the view, but now that you're saying that, maybe for also
the breezes.
And another use for sleeping.
Yep, probably so. But unfortunately, all good things come to an end. And the golden age of the porch started to come to an end about the 1930s. And I would say it reached its height in the 1960s. And a number of factors all contributed to the decline. And a lot of this is just like architectural styles themselves. The way the porch was constructed kind of has an association with a particular time and a way of life. And maybe by the 1930s that was seen as unfashionable, antiquated. You didn't want to be associated with that. So according to some home magazines of the 1930s and 40s, the best way to modernize your house was to tear off the old-fashioned porch and add the simple modern stoop. So now we're going back to our Federal and Greek Revival style roots. But this modernization might also have been a reaction to a lot of those large, mostly wood porches starting to need maintenance. And either the family couldn't afford it, or it was sold, maybe the house was divided up into apartments. There was no longer the money necessarily to keep up with a porch like that. And removing it for a stoop would have been probably their most cost-effective method. Another thing that you might not think of in the improvement cycle was the advent of indoor plumbing. Because in a lot of these smaller homes, if you had a sleeping porch, that might be the best or only place you could have run some plumbing for a bathroom or a laundry room. And instead of building on something else and trying to keep the porch, you could just enclose the porch in and do it from there. On the other hand, if you had porches that were definitely of a Victorian era that were on a known older home, a lot of times if people were working on them as part of a restoration, and especially I would say about the 1970s when we had this bicentennial craze. And I think we heard last time from our log structures, suddenly it became fashionable to have a log house. In the 1970s, it became very fashionable to have a house that looked like it would have in your 1780s to 1850s. And those Victorian porches were just, a big stylistic clue that they were a later addition, and they came off. And one of the other things that I've never really seen anybody mention, but it seems pretty likely that sleeping porches in particular maybe had this association with tuberculosis and sickness, and he wanted to maybe do away with that part of the house's history. One quote I found from an architect in particular was pretty good. It is almost impossible to make a large open sleeping porch look like anything but the outdoor ward of a tuberculosis sanatorium. So we make drawings for glass-enclosed porches, which, if they don't ruin the looks of the outside of the house, at least go a long way toward it. And when the thing is all done, Mrs. Client comes along and says, "What am I going to do with that sleeping porch? It is so ugly." And then, of course, as Ed mentioned, technology really started to change our creature comforts. And they really lessened the need for people to go out and use your porch every day. Air conditioning, of course, is the big one. Now your house could be cooler inside than it was outside. porch was no longer such an attractive option. Television is another big one. You might have been able to take your radio over to a window, prop it open. You could still hear the radio and sit on the porch. But with the TV, you weren't going to move it in and out and, try to sit out there and watch it too. So you just kind of gathered around inside. Telephones were another one. It became a lot easier to maybe call someone on the phone than to walk down the street and check on them. Cars get a bad rap in historic preservation, but they really changed a lot of the way we use buildings and think of buildings. And they probably had an impact on porches because all of a sudden you had cars, they were noisy, they had exhaust fumes. It was no longer maybe so relaxing to go out and sit on a porch, particularly if you were on a main road. Maybe you had traffic all night long and you could no longer get that quiet, peaceful setting that you used to have. And overall, there was a cultural shift that led towards more individual activities instead of community-oriented activities. So this is about the same time that you're going to see decks and patios in the back of houses that maybe they were fenced off and screened from view. So the family could go out there, have a party, relax in peace, and the neighbors, if you saw them out, you wouldn't necessarily just go over and invite yourself over to sit down and talk for a while. All of that said, porches never really went away in the South. Even if you maybe had a ranch house that you just had like a little tiny landing, it was enough to put a chair out there, a decorative bench, something to show that this is still the front of a home. But maybe you didn't use it. Maybe you went in through your carport. You could just go in through the side. But in planning, they started to make a comeback. Earliest references I found was about the 1980s. And people started to realize that if you had a porch that was big enough to use, it helped to promote the feelings of neighborliness and community by giving people a designated public-private space. Maybe you don't know your neighbor well enough to invite them in your home, but you would feel comfortable enough talking to them on your front porch. And one of the other things that they realized was if you had a porch that was big enough to use and you had people that were outside actually using it, you had additional eyes on the neighborhood that would help deter crime and other weird shenanigans that might go on. But sometimes, if you're building a new house, you might just want a porch for the nostalgia. Maybe you had one as a child, you really remember it fondly, and you want to recapture some of that. Porches definitely have an association with your family and simpler times. So, I hope this has kind of given you top-down 1,000-meter view of porches and their history and how they evolved. And I know that I probably didn't cover everything you might have hoped to hear. So I have a couple further porch reading. Most of these you can find online. The style guide that I passed out was adapted from the Field Guide to American Houses by Virginia and Lee McAllister. That is an actual book. I would imagine they probably have that at the Hanley Library. Your Old House Journal, I was surprised to find those are now online. You can find those if you Google for them. And Evolution of the American Front Porch was a good kind of starting point for this. But if maybe you have a porch and you're thinking about what to do with it, how to do something to it, if you're missing some item, these 3 links have some good suggestions on either how to preserve it, maintain it, build something to match. So I hope that was interesting, and so I can take some questions now if anybody has any or comments. Or yes.
We moved into our 1941 house here in 1999, and we at that time still had the sleeping porch in the second floor, which
Yeah.
We enclosed to make it into a bathroom.
Yep.
Well, I don't know if you have any encountered anything on the, I was kind of curious that the floor of that porch was slanted.
Yep.
Is that a feature or is there a reason for that that you can?
Yep. You'd want to have your water drain off.
So, because you could get rain dropping
Yep.
in. Okay, so you already.
Yep.
Yeah. It was uncomfortable to sit on.
Yes.
But it's no problem if you're laying down.
Yeah. Yes.
I understood that then the word veranda came from India,
India. Yep.
the British.
Yeah. British colonial, I would say in India, kind of introduced that word to us. Same thing with bungalow. Until that point, you might refer to a porch as like a loggia or a piazza. Italian. English is a fun language. We just steal words that we like and reuse them.
I have a second question. In your research, Sandra, was there anything about the effect of climate on porches? You would think there would be some, obviously you get to very cold climates.
Oh, yeah.
But I think of, certainly in New England, there are plenty of porches. I wonder to what degree there's a direct relationship, because until you get way up to the frozen north, you always have some time of the year when you might want to sit outside.
Yeah, I didn't get to incorporate it in this program, but amazingly, the government does studies on a lot of things, and I think it was about 1930. They did a study on porches, and they kind of divided the country up into sections, and I can't think of what it was called right now, but probably if you search for it a little bit, you'll find it. They kind of did it by what the porch was used for, how big it was, where it was located on the house. I can't remember exactly what our kind of subset was, but like Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, we were all kind of in this one group that had it, I think especially for that outdoor dining, for your dinner, especially if you had extra farm hands. You wouldn't necessarily want them inside your house, but if you had a porch, you would feed them on the porch. So there's a lot more out there that I just couldn't get into for this presentation. Yes.
My husband couldn't come, but I
Yes.
think he'll be interested in preserving that historic wood, because our porch, he's had to replace that tongue and groove.
Yes.
He's found a new system he's going to try. But he's worked on that. And on our steps, they had a western exposure, and we've been trips on the steps. It turns out great. But his family home had a porch, and yes, they enclosed part of it for the bathroom, and on and on. And we want to keep that porch in good order, because his dad actually fell through his porch one time.
Oh!
But he sat out there every day after dinner.
Yep.
And people would drive by and stop, pull the car into the drive, come up to the porch and talk. It's great. So we have a lot of sentimental attachment
Yes.
as well.
I think
Is the porch name?
I think I saw some references about 1920, 1930, but it might have actually been a little older than that. I didn't get too far into that, but that's a good question. Yeah.
Have some porches are missed naming them? Should be a sunroom or how's that sun porch?
Sun porches, yeah. Basically, that kind of overall definition of a porch, even if they enclose it in glass, a lot of places will still just call it a porch. One of our board members kind of surprised me. She said, "What about Florida rooms?" And I went, "Florida rooms? What's that?" So that's the same thing. It's a sun porch, but I think it probably came in maybe 1950s or so. You would call it a Florida room. Same concept, but you know.
Lots of sunshine.
Yep, lots of sunshine. Keep your plants in there, especially for the winter. That was a big thing for a lot of those. Oh, thank you all. Got some really good questions.